Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Labour Justice Barometer podcast. I'm Aisha Adam.
And I'm Debbie Collier.
And we're your hosts today on the Labour Justice Barometer. In this episode of the Labour Justice Barometer, we'll be diving into a critical and timely topic, the intersection of labour law, climate change, and social justice. Particularly as South Africa embarks on its journey towards a low-carbon economy, the concept of a just transition has never been more important. We'll explore what a just transition means for workers and employers, drawing on insights from the report Optimizing Labour Law for a Just Transition, which is one out of 5 reports to be published in the NEDLAC Labour Law series. We'll unpack the challenges facing coal-reliant communities, global insights, and the role labour law plays in ensuring fairness and inclusion during this shift. So welcome back to another episode, and Happy New Year to all our listeners, and Happy New Year to you too, Debbie.
Happy New Year, Aisha. How are you? Did you have a good break?
I actually did. I think it was very much needed. I find December is a very productive time, but it was a much needed break, and I hope you actually had a break. Last time we recorded, you weren't feeling well, so I hope you managed to recover.
Yes, I'm recovered from COVID, thank you. And it's good to be back.
See, who knew COVID was still a thing after all of that?
Apparently so.
See, this is how they kind of filtered out the flu as well. It's interesting to see how something that changed the way the whole world worked a couple of years ago has now become so normalized. So it's just amazing to see how things just progress over time. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about a just transition paper that was written by yourself, Debbie, and Shane Godfrey, and Vincent Oniga, and Abigail Oniga at Centro. Just tell us, what was the objective in writing this report? Tell us all about it.
Aisha, yes. The report is Optimizing Labour Law for a Just Transition. It's one of 5 papers we prepared for the National Economic Development and Labour Council, NEDLAC, which was aimed at supporting NEDLAC and its social partners to develop policy and, where appropriate, legislative amendments in ongoing labour law reform processes. And so the reports were developed through a process of engagement with the social partners at NEDLAC, and areas where law and policy may need development had been identified. These are in response to the changing nature of work, as well as the labour market impact of a just transition to a low-carbon economy. And so this is, of course, where the just transition aspect and our climate change law comes in. And the idea of the reports is to encourage social dialogue and critical engagement on the development and evolution of labour law, and also to build capacity around these emerging issues and to enable critical engagement in shaping a just and inclusive labour market. So the reports, the 5 reports, are the outputs from these processes, and they're intended to be a foundation for future direction. So they really are working papers intended to take matters forward. And so specifically on Optimizing Labour Law for a Just Transition report, one of the key objectives was to engage with our emerging climate change law. And of course, in 2024, the Climate Change Act was enacted. We can leave a link to that for our listeners so that they can access the Act. So the Act has been enacted, but it's still waiting to be operationalized on a date that will be gazetted. And this is to determine how South Africa's commitment to decarbonize will be achieved, and the framework for doing so. So our purpose and the objective of the paper was to look at what were the synergies between climate law and labour law. Were there any synergies? And how it would impact not only climate change itself, but the law enacted to reduce our emissions. How would that impact on the labour market? What does it mean for labour law if our labour market is significantly impacted? How can labour law develop or evolve, both to support decarbonisation processes and an energy transition away from fossil fuels, but without compromising the labour market in terms of levels of employment, working conditions? So in other words, we were seeking to ensure that a transition would indeed be just. It must support an upgrading of rights, really. South Africa struggles with its triple challenge of unemployment, inequality, and poverty. And so an energy transition, to be a just transition, cannot make those conditions worse, but rather should be an opportunity to improve the struggles that we have in the labour market.
This is fantastic. 5 reports on this. You sent me the first one, and we'll leave a link for our listeners as well to actually read this report on the Central website. And in the actual link, you'll see towards the end of it, you can see all the different papers that I think are coming into play. And that's why I'm very excited to speak about this as well, because climate change, everyone talks about it, but they don't talk about it with the idea of looking at how it impacts labour law, particularly in South Africa, particularly also looking at the informal economy, and like you said, poverty, and looking at equality and unemployment. These are the unholy trinity, let's put it that way. So tell me, what were the key findings from this report?
So our key findings, well, we had findings both at an abstract level as well as at a more concrete and practical level. These really are evolving principles, particularly our climate change law. So we looked at where there could be alignment and synergies. What would be considered to be points of deviation? How do these 2 areas of law really interact and speak to us? In terms of alignment and synergies, what's quite remarkable about the Climate Change Act is that it uses in its definition of the term just transition. It talks about transitioning to a low carbon economy, which is a fundamental restructuring of our economy in terms of our industrial activities, as being a means to contribute to the creation of decent work. And the use of the term decent work resonates in the world of labour and labour law. Decent work is an ILO concept. And so there really is an opportunity for labour law and climate change law to mobilise around this word decent work. And the just transition concept itself is underpinned by principles of distributive justice, restorative justice, and procedural justice, which are very much aligned with the principles that underpin labour law, but the just transition and climate change law is a much broader concept and notion, and it embraces much more than what would be considered within the scope of labour law. So while they might align, they certainly span different activities within society. The just transition concept encompasses aspects of environmental justice, which is where the points of deviation come in, because labour law is just traditionally not at all concerned with environmental degradation. In fact, labour law is dependent on processes of industrialization. Labour law has grown alongside industrial development, and so to some extent it's dependent on extractive mining, and so we have to think about new ways of articulating our objectives of labour law as well, and our vision of labour law, so that we can transition to a low carbon economy without compromising the gains that labour has made. So, that is one point of deviation in an abstract sense, that climate change law is more concerned about environmental degradation and social impacts, whereas labour law is not traditionally concerned outside of workers who are employees. So we do consider in the paper ways in which labour law could evolve to encompass this broader range of objectives in terms of industrial processes that would support a just transition and a low carbon economy. And then we develop a typology of labour law functions in the paper and mechanisms that could support just transition processes without undermining gains that have already been made in terms of labour standards and labour rights. And we look at the use of consultation and collective bargaining processes, and moving beyond adversarial collective bargaining, which is concerned primarily with the distribution of the economic gains of industrialization, but into a much more cooperative and consultative manner of reaching agreement on how transitions can be affected, so that we can move into a low carbon economy, and recognizing the impact that this could have on employment and how we manage that. Because of course, restructuring, retrenchments are on the cards with the transition to a low carbon economy. There's a massive need for training, reskilling, to ensure that workers are either fit for new forms of work, organizing work, where there's just restructuring, but where business is closed down because of a just transition, workers must be equipped for employment elsewhere, or for self-employment. And we look at mechanisms around unemployment insurance and income support in times of transition, as well as health and safety considerations. These are, we do look beyond we look into the impact of climate change on worker health and safety. I think in the last few days we've seen that the target of 1.5 degrees Celsius has now been breached. I think we've reached that critical point. Working in warmer temperatures, it does have significant implications for worker health and safety. And so we consider those. In fact, in a separate paper, we developed that further. And then what we are also seeing is an increase in extreme weather events, flooding, and the like. And the need for emergency and disaster management responses will likely become increasingly amplified. And so we link in the mechanisms that we currently have and develop ways in which these could be improved, could evolve to be more effective as mechanisms for achieving a just transition in ways that workers' rights are not undermined, but rather are improved. And then the paper also, it engages with the mechanisms and frameworks coming out of the just transition concept within the Presidential Climate Commission, which has a just transition framework, as well as the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan and Implementation Plan that have been developed in the Office of the President. So from a practical level, we look at what the sort of anticipated impact of transitioning sectors and industries into a low carbon forms of production, and the ones that are identified in these investment plans and just transition framework, we discuss them, and we're looking primarily, of course, at the coal sector and the impact on particularly in the Mpumalanga region, but we also we use that as a case study for other sectors that are impacted, and unpack that a little bit more. But the other sectors that would be impacted is the automotive sector, and the transition to new energy vehicles, the production of green hydrogen, and then also in the just transition framework, agriculture and tourism are highlighted as sectors that would be impacted. Asha, I hope that's not too much information.
No, Debbie, that's a fantastic summary of what the paper actually speaks to. I mean, it dives into a lot of detail, and I think this is what our audience needs to just remember when they read this. And that's why you've given such a fantastic summary. But it touches on all those important aspects. Particularly, what I really appreciated was your summary of the 6 mechanisms, the typology that you created. One in particular was definitely the health and safety, especially with South Africa, Africa in particular, definitely impacted a lot by heat, and that is something that affects a lot of countries in the world, but particularly Southern Africa. That is something that needs to be taken into account, because you have a lot of informal workers in these spaces and how it impacts them. And that's also what I think will bring me to my next question. How have other countries actually responded to these impacts in terms of your report?
Yes, actually, you're correct. So, the temperatures are increasing faster in South Africa and on the African continent than they are elsewhere in the world. So we are one of the regions impacted. And I think it was two years ago this time that we had farm workers in the Northern Cape. I think it was 7 farm workers who died of heat stroke in degrees that exceeded 40 degrees, and they were working in agriculture. So agriculture and construction are 2 key areas where outdoor working conditions in heat present specific occupational health and safety hazards. And interestingly, in preparing for the FIFA World Cup in 2022, Qatar needed to speed up their labour law reforms. So they had a less than stellar labour rights record.
Put it nicely, yeah.
So they worked with the ILO from around 2018, a few years prior to the World Cup, and they did a few occupational heat studies. and they collected data on the mental and physical health, physiological health, and what the different strategies could be in varying environmental conditions. And this subsequently resulted in a piece of legislation, regulation, or a minister's decision, which specified statutory measures that would protect workers from heat stress. And it's quite remarkable how successful some of these measures have been in terms of reducing hospitalization due to health issues and heat stress. So some of the mechanisms that can be used and were used in this regulatory instrument are, a requirement that work must cease when temperatures exceed a particular, when temperatures reach a particular point. I think in this particular case, it was 32.1 degrees Celsius. Prohibiting outdoor work during peak hours during particular months of the year. So in Qatar, between 10 and 3:30 in the day between the months of June and mid-September. And then also just being really instructive with guidelines on rehydration, on taking breaks, and being able to assess risks and to manage those risks when they occur. So this all happened, under the ILO's watch, and I think it's been very successful in reducing, I think, up to 50% workers' hospitalization. And then we've also seen in 2019 the Mauritius Workers' Rights Act. I mentioned, in addition to extreme heat, climatic conditions, which may or may not be related to climate change, but nonetheless impact on workers. We're seeing an increasing frameworks of regulation to deal with these climatic conditions. And so in the Mauritius case, it will be making provision for payment of a day's remuneration if work is stopped, provided that, I think in the case of Mauritius, 2 hours had been completed, a full day's remuneration would be due. And then we're seeing, and similar provisions, I won't go through all of them, but it just allows for remuneration to be made in specific conditions, like where cyclone warnings have been issued or enforced, and also a rate of pay for remuneration if work is performed, even if it's performed at home where there's extreme weather conditions. So we're also seeing definitions of terms like extreme weather conditions being defined, and more forms of insurances for workers to be paid in circumstances of extreme weather conditions, or for income support and social protection when work is stopped because of impossibility of performance, and that impossibility of performance including conditions related to climate and climate change.
You're listening to the Labour Justice Barometer, and we'll be right back. Debbie, even just reading through, the report of what you spoke about, just of these different countries, what came to mind now was, I'm not sure if you saw, I'm pretty sure you must have seen it on the news about the Palisades fire in America that's currently going on in California. And in these areas, there's been vast complaints because California is also one of those areas where a lot of fires break out. And obviously lots of homes are being burnt, and it obviously leads to these firefighters who are underpaid or misclassified. Actually, what happened was last year in September, I remember reading an article in The Guardian about how their burnt out firefighters are fleeing the US Forest Service because of labor disputes, because they're not getting paid a lot, they're being short-staffed. There's a lot of risk involved in firefighting as well, and the exposure to heat stroke, the exposure to dehydration, and a lot of, respiratory issues. These are things which weren't really considered by the US Forest Service. And when I think about, even with Qatar, as you mentioned here, even just things that you mentioned in terms of wearing bright reflective clothing makes such a big difference. Or if, for example, they, if they're going to have to work during these hours, then their pay should increase in a certain way. I think that was the case for Mauritius as well, where your remuneration is increased. And it's all in the report, so everyone who's listening to this can read this. But that's just what came to mind, that this is now becoming a recurring issue, and it's progressing continuously around the world, not just in South Africa, but it's something that needs to be considered more seriously. And this report is very forward-looking. It speaks to a lot of aspects, which I think, something that needs to be taken seriously, and I recommend everybody read, and, read with a fine-tooth comb as well. But how do you think South Africa's labour law framework can evolve to better integrate environmental and social justice concerns moving forward? Because that's not something that's always considered enough.
I think it'll be interesting, and perhaps we can provide a link to this, because it's not an aspect that I explored in the recent conditions, but California is one of the states that we mentioned in the report for having recently introduced a specific framework for dealing with heat stress. So it'll be interesting to see how those recent amendments interact with plight of firefighters. And of course, as you mentioned, if the problem is one of their classification as workers who are protected by labour legislation, that might exclude them from the protection. So I think that's definitely an area for further consideration, and thanks for raising that. So getting back to your question around the report, look, it is forward-looking in the sense that these are emerging concepts, forging the pathway as these developments occur. And I mentioned up front that the Climate Change Act is yet to be set for it to be operationalized, which is because the mechanisms are being put in place for the Act to be implemented. So it's good for the labour law framework, and those obviously involved in labour law is developed in tripartite structures under NEDLAC, but also in workplaces and at sector level. And it is good for this conversation to take place. And that's really these building blocks that we identify in the report without being prescriptive, but we do need to see much greater coordination between the different institutions that are involved in delivering the programs and services that will be needed for a just transition. So we need to see a lot of cooperation between institutions and not a guarding of jurisdictional boundaries, but rather cooperation and coordination. And we talk a little bit about what that would involve. as well as integrated frameworks and instruments. One of the annexures in the report is potential templates or model agreements for trade unions and employers, or workers and employers, which, just to give some ideas of the sorts of planning that can go into a just transition. It should happen years before and not months before. We have frameworks in place for, workplace consultation. The workplace forums should have been those institutions, but we fall back on collective bargaining. And so the planning that we need, the multi-year planning by agreement, really needs perhaps a bit more structure. And that's something that the social partners can consider in terms of providing guidance on, 5 years before a transition, start putting in place the training. So there's all sorts of auditing that needs to take place, and planning, and issues that should be on the agenda, both at workplace level, at sector and industry level, and at national level. And we provide some context for this in the report. And then one of the areas of law that, and I think it is under consideration in multiple forums, so we're again not prescriptive, but access to social protection for workers. Currently social protection and forms of social security are largely reserved for workers who are employed as employees. We are looking at a transition not just in the context of climate change, but also in the context of advanced technologies that is eroding this traditional employer-employee relationship. And so that in itself is a challenge to the labour laws that we have. And these are, of course, all matters that the social partners and NEDLAC are grappling with, developing new ways of regulating. But there's something that also we shouldn't lose sight of course, is that our route to democracy, and not just in South Africa, but the importance that worker organising and trade union formations in the fossil fuels, in the coal sector, that was core to the pathway for democracy and social justice. And so we need to make sure also that in this just transition, where we're transitioning to alternative sources of energy, and our workplace is becoming more diffuse in terms of production and forms of work, that we don't undermine the gains that have been made in terms of these industrialization processes. Yeah, so actually it's very much work in progress. What is going to become increasingly important is the role of local authorities and what happens at municipal level. So there's a lot of capacitation that needs to happen in terms of having the mechanisms in place to support a just transition. And it's not going to be planned at a central level and one transition with every industry and sector and workplace transitioning according to plan, but rather it's going to be taking place in multiple ways and processes.
And I think that's exactly what we have to look forward to in the podcast, is that there's still 4 more papers that we have to dive into. And I'm very excited. I mean, this is just 1 out of 5. So it's this labor law series by NEDLAC, and the work that you and the central members that you worked with on this report have done has just shown that, there is a lot of changes that need to be responded to, especially in the terms of nature of work, the future of work, and how this will be impacting as this transition to a low carbon economy. I certainly learned a lot. I don't think I knew as much about climate change impacts on labor law as I did after reading this paper. And I think it's something that, something we all need to take into account as we go into these spaces, especially as we go into 2025. And this is, again, just to remind any new listener or old listener who's heard us for our previous episodes, that this podcast is here to just navigate this critical shift that happens. We're here to, to advocate and discuss and promote the dialogue of inclusion and social justice. And I'm very grateful to you, Debbie, for actually joining us today, especially someone who's written on this and who's going to be explaining more on this, and that on the 4 more papers we have to look forward to.
Thanks, Asha. I hope that you didn't hear my dog Asterix in the background. I think he was joining in. Asha, and just to wish you well for the year ahead. Thanks for your kind remarks. I do. This was a learning curve for us too, and I think there's a lot for us to unpack going forward. And I look forward to continuing the conversation with you, and I hope our listeners have also enjoyed at least some of the information we've shared today.
This podcast is not intended to constitute legal advice.